Today's Tea Party rallies, with their anti-government slogans and objections to uncontrolled spending, hark back to a founding event in the history of American liberty. The original Boston Tea Party, in which the colonists threw British tea into Boston Harbor, took place in 1773. The colonists weren't merely protesting against England or tea, but against a special tax imposed on the tea by England, a tax of the sort that previously only the colonial governments themselves had imposed ever since the first colonists arrived over a century and a half earlier. Taxation without representation was the issue. That is, taxation by the Parliament back in England, which was not elected by the colonists, who had grown accustomed to running their own affairs in the New World, with little government to answer to, and few traces of the aristocracy that dominated back in Europe. The colonists rebelled on legal principle, even though tax rates back then were significantly lower than they are today. Indeed, the colonists were arguably the lowest taxed people in recorded history. So it wasn't the pain inflicted by the tax that they were worried about. It was the political implications. And indeed, England reacted to the Boston Tea Party with the so-called coercive acts in 1774, which shut down commerce in Boston Harbor, permitted the King of England to appoint Massachusetts officials, and quartered troops in the colonists' homes. All transgressions that would not be forgotten when the colonists went on to write their own constitution. But Americans were not unanimous about what form of government they should have. Even as the Revolutionary War began in 1775, and the Declaration of Independence was issued in 1776 with its explicit endorsement of individual liberty, there were divisions among the revolutionaries about how to govern themselves. Federalists, such as Alexander Hamilton, were most concerned about ensuring stable, centralized rule of law, in part to foster business after a period of war debts. But groups like the Sons of Liberty, equally in love with freedom, were almost anarchic in their approach to law. In the decade leading up to the Revolution, their notoriously boisterous demonstrations sometimes became violent mobs and ousted local governments, British allied or not, and rewrote laws on the spot, sometimes declaring government debts to be null and void, to the alarm of Hamilton, who feared a future in which no one would want to do business in the former colonies. From the beginning, then, the American experiment was an effort to avoid too much government, but also to avoid the chaos of lawlessness. The initial compromise, ratified in 1781 during the Revolutionary War, was the Articles of Confederation, which preserved experimentation by leaving the states almost completely separate entities, tied by a loose alliance and a central government that did not even have the power to tax, but merely to request funds from the states, making repayment of war debts unlikely. Hamilton's Federalist faction, seeing repayment of the war debt as essential to establishing the colony's fiscal reliability and fostering business, won in the end, and the Articles of Confederation were replaced after only 6 years by the Constitution. For good or ill, America now had a true central government, but it was strictly limited in its powers. Indeed, Hamilton's faction favored a strong central government and even wanted George Washington to become a king. Jefferson wanted government limited to only what the Constitution authorized it to do. No power was to be exercised by the new federal government that had not been explicitly granted to it by the Constitution, almost the opposite of the view commonly held today that government can do just about anything it wants unless it is expressly forbidden in the Constitution, and very different from the view taken of the king's wide-ranging powers back in Europe. Americans were by no means completely free in the early days of the Republic. Slavery existed, Only land-owning white males could vote, and some state laws were as intrusive as the federal laws we complain of today. Indeed, it's striking that many basic political issues we now take for granted were still being debated as recently as 2 centuries ago, such as whether one should farm one's own land in order to claim ownership of it. But the threat from a single centralized power was largely tamed, at least for a time, and there was a widespread respect for due process and a wariness about arbitrary exercises of power. Unfortunately, the Constitution's limits on the central government would gradually erode. The story of American liberty and the threats to freedom was just beginning.